Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Things Left Unspoken, a novel by Eva Marie Everson, narrated by Richardson. Renovate. 1. To restore to a former, better state, as by cleaning, repairing, rebuilding. 2. To restore to life, vigor, or activity. Preserve. 1. To keep safe from injury, harm, or destruction. Protect. 2. To keep alive, intact, or free from decay. Maintain. 3. Fruit canned or made into jams or jellies. 1. It snowed the day we buried Uncle Jim. Not the kind of snow that flurries about your face or drives itself sideways, turning the world into a blinding sheet of white. This was angels dancing on air. When the first flake touched my cheek, I felt the icy wet kiss and looked up past the rows of granite markers, some shiny as silver and others cracked and gray, and into a fortress of old oaks, Spanish moss dripping from barren limbs. Another flake landed on my eyelashes. I batted them, then raised my gloved hand to brush it away. I looked at my mother, who caught my movement. We sat shoulder to shoulder in the front row of chairs reserved for the family, as though we were aristocrats who'd managed to snag the best seats at the opera. Our eyes locked as she reached for my hand, then squeezed. I took a deep breath and looked away. The pain of loss in her eyes was too much, especially at this moment, with great Uncle Jim not 6 feet away, entombed by polished cherry and cold white satin. A gust of wind blew against my back, and I glanced toward the open sky, nearly white with the cold. I lifted my chin, and the breeze skipped on my shoulder and tickled my ear. I'm not there. My voice was barely audible, but my mother turned and gave me a harsh look. Jo-Lynn! She whispered my name in admonishment, as though I were a child, then nodded toward the youthful pastor who stood shivering on the other side of the casket, reading from a book of prayers. He'd never once laid eyes on Uncle Jim. Other than speaking recitations, there wasn't much else he could say. Uncle Jim had never been one for going to church. For the life of me, I couldn't remember a single time I'd seen him sitting in one of the hard pews at Upper Creek Primitive Baptist Church, or standing rigid with a hymnal spread against his open palms. But I'd heard him talking to God in the fields behind the big house, listened in the cool of the evenings as he sang "In the Sweet By and By," while rocking in one of the front porch rockers that lined the wraparound of the old Victorian he and Aunt Stella called home. He wasn't a religious man, but his prayers before dinner were more like conversations with the Almighty than grace. "Most beloved Heavenly Father," he would begin. Then he would thank God for every single item on the table, for the hands that prepared them, typically Aunt Stella's, and for those who would be blessed by them. "Keep our bodies healthy for thy service on earth, and purified for thy kingdom in heaven." I remember raising my head ever so slightly, peeking through one eye at him. His ruddy face and drooping jowls quivered. His eyes were squeezed shut, tiny slits behind black-rimmed glasses. His hair, dark blonde and thinning, shimmered in the glow from the overhead kitchen light. At the big house, breakfast, lunch, and dinner were eaten in the kitchen. We never ate in the formal dining room, though it was certainly laid out, ready for guests. Uncle Jim said it was just a waste of space, and if he'd built the house, he would have left that room off. Growing up, I imagined that if I'd built the house, I'd use it for every meal. My great-grandparents, Aunt Stella's mother and father, had built the house before they married in the late 1800s. It was 1896, to be exact, when my grandmother came to live here as a bride at 16 to her dashing older groom, 10 years her senior. As the story goes, he met her, fell in love with her, married her against the wishes of her family, and then carried her over the threshold of this sprawling two-story, with tucked-away rooms, long hallways, and an honest-to-goodness brick well on the back porch. Still to this day one can drop an old wooden bucket down into its depths, and then, using a beat-up, long-handled tin dipper, sip of something so sweet and clean it almost doesn't seem real. Liquid heaven, Uncle Jim used to call it. In the early days, beyond those rose-covered trellises on the back porch, perfect rows of vegetables for canning and freezing were planted, both for our family and for neighbors in need when there was abundance. Standing behind the small garden was the farm. It extended alongside the highway that ran beside the left side of the house. The crops stretched toward the horizon and out of sight, interrupted only by the leaning of an old barn, the rise of a tin silo, or the deliberate movement of a John Deere tractor. But those days were long gone. That was a time when everything seemed to be about life and living. These past few decades the earth hasn't been tilled or loved. No planting, no praying for rain, no harvesting, nothing to show for what had been, except the gray of the packed soil and an occasional twig rising up from out of the ground, a remnant of the last crop. Of what my great-grandparents had built, only the big house remained, and it was a part of the remnant of what had at one time been a thriving farm in Cottonwood, Georgia. I blinked several times and brushed away those memories of life. There was too much heartache in the moment to allow myself to remain within them. Now was the time to reflect on death and dying. I could sit here and commiserate, and no one would be the wiser as to the depths into which I was fallen. But I knew that when the funeral was over, when the casket had been lowered into the ground, and the last clump of dirt had been patted down, and the clusters of floral arrangements had been placed strategically about the mound, I'd see that old, proud house filled with family and friends eating fine Southern cooking off chinette plates, reminiscing about the time Uncle Jim did thus and such, and then throwing back their heads and bellowing at their memories. But I would move about the house I had loved my whole life, touching old photographs, their frames caked with dust, seeking a flicker of solitude where I could grieve in my own way for the man I'd loved more like a great-grandfather than a great-uncle, a man who, it seemed, was always right where I needed him to be, except now, when I needed him most. 2. Just as I expected, the house was filled with folks sipping hot coffee, dipping their forks into Mrs. Patterson's banana cream pie, and alternating between thunderous exchanges about Uncle Jim's antics and the quiet moments that came with the memory of his death. I had left Mother and Aunt Stella in the kitchen, fretting over where to put all the food that had come in. "You won't have to cook for a month of Sundays," Mother was saying. As I pushed my way through the heavy swinging door, I glanced over my shoulder at the two of them. They were a picture of opposites. Mother tall, her aunt short. Mother's hair dark and wavy and straight from a bottle. Aunt Stella's hair thinning and cottony white and straight from nature. Mother's posture always upright. I can't remember when Aunt Stella didn't hump over. When Mother speaks, her voice is quiet but firm. Aunt Stella, a smoker from the age of 9, has a raspy voice. Though she is a gentle, sweet soul, most of the time her words sound harsh, and a compliment sounds more like a reprimand. I smiled, released the door, and walked down the long, cold hallway toward the living room, where most of the people had gathered. In my desire to suspend time, I took deliberate steps, then stopped. I drank in the sights and sounds of the old house. I called upon imagination and heard the laughter of all those who'd called this their home. The children who had run through this hall, then up the stairs. The adults who'd called after them, "Stop your running in the house now," they'd say, and the children would call back, "Yes'm," or "Okay, sir." I turned a slow circle, dipping my neck back, and peered upward. Ceilings of dull white paint, barren water stains amber with age, towered at 12 feet. The walls were cracked and peeling. The floors, made from wide heart-of-pine boards, could have used stripping and refinishing years ago. 4 oblong wool rugs, their design faded beyond remembrance, ran the length of the room. As I started toward the living room, they muffled my steps with a familiarity I found strangely comforting. They brought a rhythm I'd lost long ago. This was the sound of my childhood, when I'd known exactly where I was going and what I was doing, if only for the day. This was the tapping of heels on wood and the padding of soles on carpet. I reached the closed French doors leading to the living room. I opened one of them slowly, not wanting to be jarred out of my reverie. I closed the door behind me, and life returned in an onslaught of conversation and heat from the fireplace. I spotted my father right away, sitting in the middle of the overstuffed and outdated sofa. Uncle Bob, Mother's older brother, sat next to him. They were engaged in conversation, as always when the family got together. I couldn't hear them over the other banter, but I caught words like bow hunting and next deer season. These were the words all Southern men knew, possibly from birth. I made my way past the clusters of people toward a small table in front of one of the half-dozen floor-to-ceiling windows in the room. Atop it sat an antique lamp, the tattered family Bible, and a small box stuffed with black and white photographs with curling edges. I knew the box well. Digging into its contents was one of my favorite things to do when I came to the big house. "Jo-Lynn!" I turned. "Doris. Hi." I stepped forward to give Uncle Jim and Aunt Stella's daughter a quick hug. "I'm so sorry for your loss." I drew back and looked at her. If the frayed edges were any indication, her long blonde hair had been bleached one too many times, and it appeared her makeup had been applied with a shaky hand. "Daddy was a cat pistol, wasn't he?" The question was rhetorical. "He's going to be missed." She took my hand and squeezed it. "I know you'll also be lost for a while. The two of you were always so close." She wrinkled her nose at me and shook her head ever so slightly, as if by making a face everything would suddenly be okay again. "He was the closest thing to a grandfather I had on Mother's side." Mother's parents had died within 6 months of each other, one of a heart attack, one in a car accident, when I was 5. "I was only 6 when my grandfather died, but I remember it so well. It was February, and it was raining. Mom always told me it was sleeting, but I don't remember that part. I just remember coming back to this house and searching every room in the house for Pops, and not being able to find him." "And now you've lost your father." "And you've lost an uncle." Even though technically Jim was my great-uncle, in the South an aunt is an aunt and an uncle is an uncle, removed or not. She squeezed my hand again. "Your parents get to a certain age, you begin to expect the day when, well, you know." Doris turned her head as her eyes scanned the room. "I haven't seen Evan." "Evan couldn't make it. His work, and the holidays being just 2 months ago, he felt he should stay. He sends his condolences, of course." Doris's smile was wry, and I wondered if she could see through my lie. The truth was, Evan hadn't come because I'd asked him not to. We hadn't said a civil word to each other in weeks, had only tolerated each other for the past few months. In spite of his attempt to reach out to me when I'd received Mother's call telling me of Uncle Jim's death, I'd brushed him away. "Please," I'd said, "just leave me alone. I'm a big girl. I can drive myself halfway across the state." I'd shaken my head. "Besides, I just don't want to be with you." "So his business is good, then?" Doris now asked. "Business is very good. It's amazing how many people are moving into the area. It's an architect's dream world over there." I forced out a laugh. "Evan and his partner are among the most successful neighborhood developers in the entire Atlanta area." Doris looked down at her hands, studied the elaborate diamonds and long red nails gracing her fingers. "And you? How's your business?" I crossed my arms and squeezed, attempting to stop the quivering rising from within. It's going." Doris's brows lifted. "As in gone?" I nodded, unable to say anything at all. Truth was, my work as an interior decorator for the design firm of Stanley and Miller had come to an end. By mutual decision, I'd left more than a month before. With my life and marriage at a crossroads, my creative juices had dried up. I wasn't able to give to the clients, and therefore was of no use to the company. I raised my hand and shooed away the memory. As in gone. I've taken a leave of absence for about a month now. I gave a nod to Doris. But I'll go back to work in time. As soon as I can figure out who I am and why I'm here in this world. Doris looked relieved. "Well, thank you, Jesus." "Excuse me?" She reached over and touched my arm with her fingertips. "Jo-Lynn, Mama and I need to talk to you later." She looked around the room. "After everyone is gone. You stick around, you hear?" "What's going on, Doris?" Doris didn't answer. Instead, her attention shifted as a hush swept over the room. I turned to watch as Aunt Stella made her way through the French doors, past a few mourners, and to the closed door leading to the bedroom she'd shared with her husband for more than 60 years. She moved like a woman on a mission, opening the door with a jerk and closing it firmly behind her, the old glass and brass doorknob rattling in the wake. Moments later, we heard the wail, the gut-wrenching cries of a woman who knew she would sleep alone every night for the rest of her life. The sobs of a wife no longer with a companion to share the days, to cook for, to clean up after, to make love to. Uncle Bob stood. "Y'all leave her alone now." He adjusted the waistband of the dark pants around his hips. "She'll be all right." I turned back to the window, peering through the lace curtains yellowed by years of cigarette smoke and neglect, to the barren land on the other side. In many ways, Aunt Stella and I were very much alike, the only difference being I couldn't find it within me to cry. 3. "What do they want to talk to you about?" Mother asked as we tied off the yellow plastic strings of the last few trash bags. I looked up at her from my bent position in the middle of the kitchen. "I have no idea." "Aunt Stella can be a sly one, whatever it is." Mother handed over a trash bag so I could haul them all out together. "It's probably a doozy." She pointed at me with a perfectly manicured finger and arched her Audrey Hepburn brow. "I'll meet you back at the house." I headed toward the back door. "You'll call me as soon as you get in your car, Jo-Lynn Hunter," she said, and suddenly I felt like a teenager with a curfew. Mother has a way about her, which I suppose is the birthright of all Southern women. With a look, a word, or the tone of her voice, she gets just what she wants. And by the very nature of her position within the community, her social sensibilities, and her ability to gently but effectively rule the roost of her home, she is accustomed to nothing less than compliance. So I said, "Yes, Mother," but as I looked over my shoulder, I winked at her. A half-hour later, I was waving good-bye to the last of the guests, Aunt Stella and Doris beside me on the front porch. Without a word, we watched their taillights heading down the endless black ribbon stretching toward their nearby homes, or to Raymore, the nearest town to Cottonwood and my hometown, then turned to one another and sighed. "Glad that's over," Aunt Stella remarked, as though she'd just come from a bad school play. The screen door moaned as I opened it, then allowed both her and Doris to walk past me before I joined them inside and closed the old wooden door. It rattled into place, and I turned the dark key in the keyhole, and then shook my head at the lack of security about the old place. "You should think about deadbolts." Doris stood in front of the fireplace, stabbing at the logs with the poker. The flames of a near-dying fire hissed and popped as they became more intense. Aunt Stella collapsed into her favorite chair, pulled a cigarette from the burgundy leather case I'd given her for Christmas several years before, flicked a plastic lighter, and drew on the cigarette I knew she'd been craving for hours. "And you should think about quitting that," I added. "Good luck, Jo-Lynn," Doris muttered with a chuckle. I took a seat in the old box-like chair next to Aunt Stella's, then looked from her to Doris and back to her again. Aunt Stella took a long drag from her cigarette, then exhaled the smoke toward the ceiling. "Doris, sit down, hon. We need to talk to Jo-Lynn." "I know, Mama," Doris said, then took a seat on the sofa, the same sofa that Daddy and Uncle Bob had been sitting on a few hours earlier. "So, what's going on?" I asked, forcing a smile. Aunt Stella turned to me. "How's Evan, Shug?" she asked. "Evan? Evan's fine." My fingers flittered about the hollow of my throat. "He's good. Evan's good. And fine. Good and fine." Aunt Stella took another drag, keeping her eyes on me the whole time. "You want to try that again?" I sighed. "What are you asking me exactly?" "Man doesn't stay home when his wife is going to the funeral of a favorite family member." I felt the heat rise into my cheeks, then looked over at Doris, who had cocked a brow toward me. "Oh," I said. "Tell me what's going on, Shug." I laid my head against the back of the chair. "We've hit a bump in the road, Aunt Stella," I said. "What kind of bump?" Doris asked. Doris never was one to stay within the boundaries of mind-your-own business. I raised my head and looked at her. "A midlife one, I suppose. Evan's been blessed, or cursed, to make enough money to buy his way out of it, and that's exactly what he's done. He thinks life is about country clubs and big boy toys, boats, hot cars, and to-die-for getaways. It's Disneyland every day, and it's just not what I want, quite frankly. I want a husband, not a sugar daddy. I want a marriage, not a vacation." I looked at the small stack of magazines sitting askew on the coffee table in front of Doris, forced myself not to get up and straighten them, then turned back to Aunt Stella as I tucked my feet up under my legs. "This should be a time when we're taking some time for ourselves, with ourselves. We've both worked hard for a good number of years, but Evan seems to be, I don't know, it's like he's in another world." "Do you think he's having an affair?" Doris asked. "Evan's not having an affair," Aunt Stella declared. "He's no fool. She crushed her cigarette in the glass ashtray sitting alone on the table between us.
"But he's a man, and men go through these things."
"Did Daddy?" Doris asked, stealing the question I was wondering. Aunt Stella rolled her eyes.
"Did he ever? God knows how much I love that man, but there were times I could have kicked him as good as looked at him."
"Mama!"
"And it was about this time in his life as it is in Evan's. Doris, you were grown and gone."
She turned to me.
"Jo-Lynn, for whatever reason you chose not to have children, but the timing is the same."
"It's not like I chose exactly. It's just that Evan didn't want children, and I went along with him." "I've always wondered what man doesn't want a son to play ball with," Doris said. "Or why you didn't want a little girl to frou-frou up badly enough to just get yourself pregnant and worry about Evan's reaction later."
Bless her heart, that Doris. What does a woman with 4 sons and a daughter know about the cravings of someone who chooses not to have children? I hadn't chosen this because I felt the world wasn't good enough for a child today, or because I wanted to get my career going and then I would start a family. I chose not to have children because it was the wish of my husband, a man who said he couldn't bear to share me with another living soul, not even a child. A man who attempted to give me the world, but in the end robbed me of my place in it. A man who said I was enough for him and he wanted to be enough for me, but we hadn't been. Certainly he had not been for me. "Well, it's too late now," I said, hoping to dismiss the subject. We drew quiet, and Aunt Stella said, "Doris, Shug, there's not any more wood in the house. Go get another log for the fire." Doris pushed herself off the sofa. "I know when I'm being asked to leave the room," she said, then slipped out of the French doors leading to the hallway, not quite closing them behind her. I felt the whoosh of cold air from the unheated back of the house. Aunt Stella turned to me. "Now you listen to me, Josephine, my Lynn Hunter. Listen to me good. One thing I know is men. How I know them we won't even get into, but I know them, and if your Uncle Jim was here right now he'd tell you the exact thing I'm going to say. You two need a time away from each other." She looked away for a moment as though she had to think what to say next, then turned back. "To reevaluate, to see your marriage for what it really is, what it's worth." She pulled another cigarette from the case and lit it. "Marriage is a good thing, and a husband is a good thing." She winked at me. "A real good thing. Sometimes, though, a marriage has to be shaken up. It isn't always about passion up under the covers. You know what I'm saying, don't you, Shug?" I felt my brow knit together. "I guess so." "Look around yourself here. What do you see?" I looked around. An old room in an old house. Aunt Stella chuckled. "Mercy, I hate to clean. I haven't so much as touched this house in years, 'cept as I had to. Doris would come ever so often and do her best, but she has her own place to deal with." From down the hallway beside me I could hear Doris's footsteps making the same sounds mine had made. Tap, tap, tap. Thump, thump, thump. Tap, tap, tap. I nodded for no apparent reason as Doris walked back in the room. Her arms hung long before her, weighted down by the tote filled with logs. Her stout frame seemed to heave under the burden. "Did I stay gone long enough?" she asked, her voice strained. "It was enough," Aunt Stella answered. "Have you told her yet?" Doris laid the tote on the hearth, brushed the debris from her hands, then returned to the sofa. "Told me what?" I asked, looking from one to the other. "Here's the thing, Jo-Lynn."
Doris said. "There's a woman, Carol with a K is her name, Carol Paisley, and she's wanting to bring Cottonwood back to its former glory."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?